Good evening all and welcome. This is your Captain Mort speaking, preparing to depart Flight 439 into darkness. Please all have your seatbelts ready, tray table stowed away, as we are going to be taking off shortly. Don't forget to download our app, Mort's Bedtime Stories, for even more stories and additional entertainment. But for now, I'm going to ask that you all remain seated and get comfortable to let the darkness take control.
I work for a national airline that mostly operates regional destinations. Mostly, we use single-aisle planes. I'm a flight attendant and usually feel safe being in a cabin full of passengers. But not this day. There are only two galleys on this plane, the front galley and the back galley. The front galley is close to the cockpit. Thus, it has an installed CCTV for the pilots to monitor activity around the cockpit door. After 9/11, everything had to be installed for extra precaution. During a flight at cruising altitude, the captain called the lead-in flight attendant, asking why they let two little kids play in front of the cockpit door. B-737 is a small plane, with the cockpit door close to the crew's seats. The leading flight attendant, with another crew member sitting at the crew member's seating area, denied any kids playing near the area, as the seats are situated right next to the cockpit door. But the captain insisted he could actually see the two kids, a boy and a girl, playing in front of the door through the CCTV. At this point, the leading flight attendant was not too happy, thinking that their pilots are pulling pranks on them. After quite some time, the captain let it go and told them to never mind. When they touched down and got to the hotel, the captain pulled the leading flight attendant along with his first officer in tow. He insisted to know if the leading flight attendant and her crew really didn't see the two kids playing in front of the cockpit door and the first galley. She maintained they didn't, and said since the galley is so small anyway, like seriously it's less than 10 meters long, only from port side to starboard side door, that consisted of crew seats, the entrance to the cockpit and the galley, she wouldn't miss two kids playing. Both pilots went blank, then said they had both seen the kids playing right next to both flight attendants, and wondered why they let them there. The first officer confirmed what his captain had seen, but because it was late, the leading wouldn't want to scare her crew and decided to keep it to herself, only asking the crew that was with her during the incident if they didn't notice any kids, but both maintained they hadn't seen any. Up to this day, no one knows who the two kids were, but both pilots saw them on CCTV. My dad is a private pilot. He's got a Cessna 172. One time we were flying to this tiny airport, owned and run by one guy. We're flying in pattern, waiting to land because there was a plane taking off. The plane didn't make it. I remember my dad describing the air being thin. It took off, started to climb, and then suddenly dropped like a rock. The pilot died on scene. His wife at least made it to the hospital. We didn't find out what happened after that. They were an older couple and the parents of the owner of the airport. They'd been visiting him. He was the only one working comms when it happened. I vividly remember the way the plane dropped, and the smoke and fire, and the trucks and ambulance. The wait to land, and watching the smoke rise, and the awful, broken up communication. It's not something I would ever wish to repeat. When I was learning to fly, I had a nearly fatal incident that could have gone horribly wrong and would have resulted in certain death. Let me tell you about it. When you land, you have to call what you're going to do. I began calling downwind, and then over the radio, someone else did too, which means we wanted to go down. I'd call base and he would too, so I was wondering if he was landing on another runway as we were mirroring these same calls to go down and land. Perhaps there was another one perpendicular to ours and he was confused with the runway number in use. I kept looking at the other runways, afraid that we would both land and meet where they intersected. We both called final, i.e. we're gonna go down. He was above me in a low wing plane, and we were below with a high wing plane. The perfect disaster. I spotted him 30 feet above us on final, probably 200 to 300 feet up, and the instructor pulled to the right and full throttle. He was quite shaken too, and we didn't talk about it for the rest of the pattern. I asked him if he was okay, and he said he was. I think I ended up saving both our lives that day by just being alert and lucky. Turns out the other dude was doing the mirror pattern as per the booklet. Our runways were right-handed, and he was flying the left-handed pattern. The runway was to be flown right-handed because of dangerous hillsides on the left-hand pattern, so we were both downwind at the time. Both base at the same time, just operating on opposite sides. He was flying in a rented plane to do one of his flying exams, and the lesson I learnt that day was the importance of specifying in radio calls right downwind, right base, especially when it's not the standard left turns. I could have died that day. So could the other people. Sometimes I think about it, and how fortunate I am to still be here. I was flying a Cessna 172 with my instructor, out towards Blythe on the way to San Diego hangar, when a sandstorm blew up underneath us. I swear the sand was so close it was causing the landing tires to spin. This was on a 3-leg check flight. We had landed at Big Bear, California to fuel, and our hot low-pressure system moved in pretty quickly. It was moving in as we were getting there, like really hot 120 degrees or so, and the air was already thin. A kid in his solo was taking off, and he got her up off the end of the runway, and he just fell out of the sky and crashed. The air was too thin because of the heat, and he ran out of runway because he couldn't get up to speed and just pulled up instead of listening to tower and aborting. He crashed and died. My dad used to be an airline captain for a major UK operator. Back in the 90s, his flight to Kabul was hijacked, and the terrorists demanded a ransom and would not let anyone off the plane once it landed. They stayed on the tarmac for 3 days straight in 45-degree heat, during which period no contact with the ground services were allowed by the terrorists. A couple of passengers died from heat exhaustion and dehydration, their bodies remaining in the cabin. Once the situation was brought under control, my dad returned home. He suffered persistent nightmares which culminated in a series of heart attacks. He was finally medically discharged and never flew again. The sky was his life and love. My fiancé was flying a military plane, working, when he looked out the window and noticed one of the turbines on the wing smoking. He radios up, trying to stay calm, and goes, guys, I think our wing is on fire. And the pilot goes, damn, again? Hold on, let me kill the engines. My fiancé says he's never been more terrified than at that moment, especially because if the plane goes down, his life is not the priority. The destruction of his equipment was, even if it cost him his life. They killed the engines, coasted for a minute or two, then turned them back on and everything was good. What's really bad is the other plane was under maintenance for an even worse issue. So that was the only plane that could get into the air, and it had to fly constantly for their mission. So they had to keep using it until the other plane got fixed. My fiancé wasn't part of the regular crew. The normal guy was sick, and my fiancé had the training and clearance, so they pulled him for it. and he said he never complained again about loading or unloading the planes after that. One of the scariest things to happen to me whilst flying was a skydiver about 20 yards off my wing. I was flying into a 172 in an uncontrolled field that I've flown into 100 times before, not knowing that after a 5-year skydiving ban there, they were allowing it on a case-by-case request. While flying in calling my position, I hear "skydiver" in the air. My first thought was, I hope they aren't flying in this direction, and then there he was. I had the image of him going through my propeller, and then immediately the thought of, oh God, please don't let me kill this guy. And then complaining that the pilot didn't call this better. And I watched as he flew off completely once the guy had jumped out. I come to find out the pilot was flying his friend to skydive to his local field, then depart to his home airport where they came from. Never did find the guy. I was once on a flight over the North Atlantic, and we fell out of the sky for about 2 minutes after dinner was served. I don't know about you, but 2 minutes of free fall, falling out the sky, can ingrain a particular kind of fear that most of the world fortunately doesn't have. It's that feeling of almost certain death as you plummet to what you expect to be your end. I put a dent in over the panel that holds the reading light, and one of them fell out. Not to mention someone up front-ended with a drink cart in their lap, and the person in the row ahead of me got my steaming hot stew all over their head. I got off that flight soaked in Coca-Cola and with a bruised head, and a fear I'll never be able to shake. This happened on a commercial flight, and we were never told what actually happened. The cabin started becoming visibly smoky and smelled strongly of smoke. It was in the window seat, and the wall/window became hot to the touch. The scariest part was that the flight attendants were clearly panicking. They were running up and down the aisles, frantically feeling all of the overhead bins for something on fire. They asked us repeatedly to check our devices to make sure nothing was overheating. People were having panic attacks, and I started wondering what it would feel like to die and how it would happen. The pilot announced that we were close enough to the airport that we were going to continue about 15 to 20 minutes and have to make an emergency landing. When we landed, the runway was lined with fire trucks, ambulances, and rescue vehicles. They didn't let us off the plane for quite some time. Ultimately, firefighters boarded and ushered us off. They never told us what happened. I had to fly back with the same airline 2 days later. While checking my bags, an employee said, "Oh my God, you were on that flight." He gave us a $15 in-flight credit and told us to call the airline for more compensation. Never did, but I still wonder, what the hell happened? My dad used to be a pilot. He once told me about how he almost crashed his Cessna because he hit some geese. He was actually preparing for a landing approach when he hit geese flying into a patch of fog. Windshield was completely shattered, and he and his passengers were covered in blood and feathers. They landed safely, but my dad was pretty scarred from that. He didn't quit flying because of it, but bird strikes remain a constant fear of his. Geese are large birds, and they did significant damage to that little plane. This actually happened on my first time flying with no instructor aboard. I was just doing a couple of laps around the specific traffic pattern. I took off, lap 1, lap 2, it went fine. Nailed a couple of radio calls and got that awesome feeling of, yeah, I got this. But lap number 3 was fine until I was setting up my final approach to land. and the GTN 750, which is basically a fancy navigation, radio, and pseudo radar system, warned me about a Cessna 1 mile out at the same altitude. I ignored it, since I already had the plane in sight and verified with the control tower that he was landing on the runway parallel to mine. Lo and behold, this dude zips under me about 200 to 300 feet, which sounds like a good amount of room, but it's actually butt-clenchingly close in a busy airspace like this. I should have applied throttle throttle and circled back around again to try, but the other plane was clear of me before this startle factor even wore off. This was made especially dangerous by the fact the plane I was flying was low wing, so I can't see underneath me, and the other plane was high wing, and he couldn't see above him, so neither of us could see each other, and the tower yelled at the guy to get out of my way, and I managed to land safely. But seriously, it could have gone terribly wrong. At my local small-town airport, there's a skydiving company. They cycle two planes up and down on busy days, and usually are a few minutes behind each other. But last summer, I happened to be parked by the airport watching, and their planes landed simultaneously. This is a single runway tiny airport. One was on the runway, and one in the grass behind it. It was pretty shocking to see. I'd watched a lot of planes land, but I'd never seen that. Last summer, I saw two of their divers pull their secondary chute on the same jump. I was watching one. Their chute got tangled in itself and wouldn't open. They were violently spinning out of control. It was scary because I was right below the drop zone. There were a lot of people like, "We gotta move." But they dropped free, and a few seconds later the secondary chute opened. Not 10 seconds later, the same thing happened for another diver. One of their chutes landed near my house, and the other a few meters away from a busy highway. That place always makes me nervous. When flying an aeroplane, you'd be surprised how oblivious some pilots can be to others sharing in your airspace, and the dangers that this cause. Such as the following example. Another plane on my left, with a distance of about a dozen feet between our wingtips. I was told after the fact that the pilot had a habit of doing unusually fast landing approaches. He was behind me, but he was so fast that he overtook me while I was in the middle of my final approach. This conversation with the tower ensued. Tower: Delta Echo Romeo Papa, do you notice anything unusual around you? Negative, tower. Pull up and go around now. Turns out the dude never noticed me. But for all of those non-pilots out there, this is what it meant. Had he approached me a little more to the right, his propeller would have made fine powder out of my own aeroplane, and I'd have come to a very definitive end had the tower not asked him to move. During a night cross-country with a friend of mine who was also a pilot in a 172, we were flying across an area by some mountains that's entirely lava rock. There's nothing there and no one really goes there. Anyway, we're flying when we suddenly see a bright light off our left wingtip. It was matching speed with us for 5 seconds, then zipped off towards the mountains and disappeared behind them. We both looked at each other, and we still have no idea what it could have been. But my guess is on a UFO. I was a flight attendant for a while, and we used to get into the cockpit sometimes mid-flight when one of the pilots needed a wee. Pretty standard procedure. So one time, sitting there and chatting with the first officer and it's pitch dark outside, I noticed a yellow flashing light on the horizon. It was the only thing I could see outside and didn't really think much about it, and kept talking with the pilot. After a few seconds, I looked again and it had moved considerably. I couldn't tell the distance, but I would say it was far away from our aircraft, so I started to think something weird was going on. Immediately, I told the pilot and we couldn't figure out what it was, and we just stared when after maybe 5 seconds later, it just flew from one side of the sky to the other and then into space. That gave me the most ominous feeling I'd ever had. I looked at the pilot, he looked back at me, and we sat there in silence thinking what the hell just happened. Immediately regretted not taking my phone out to record, but it had been a good story to tell on the following flights. I was piloting Capella Javelin 60 kilometers northeast from Dawson City. While flying relatively low and admiring the view of the wilderness, we saw a person below who was just standing and watching me from below. They were neither clothed or wore pastel-colored ones, and this stunned me for a bit, and I decided to make a broad circle above him. He, she, they didn't wave or try to attract my attention in any way. They just stood there, looking, and it soon dawned on me I felt really uncomfortable. Then it hit the fan when I saw 10 to 12 additional people slowly emerging from the closest trees. All of them were either wearing nothing or just pastel colors. I turned around that instant and floored it. I don't know what was there, but I had to get out of there as quickly as possible. I was once flying a plane, and the scariest thing that had ever happened to me was this occasion when I saw the smiling faces of 2 people in a Cessna as they near missed flew by me during training in our local practice area. They weren't talking to anyone, and it was surprising to see an airplane just appear then go past so quickly. But the scary part was seeing their eyes and teeth. They were that close to my plane. It was uncontrolled airspace, and I guess ultimately we were both responsible for separation, but it happened so very quickly, and even without a lookout, it's not really easy to spot a glint of metal in a vast open sky. I'm a bush pilot. I loaded an aircraft with 200 kilograms of dead wild boar once, and climbed to cruising altitude, and the thing starts squealing and unraveling from its straps. Its head was poking out of the bag, looked right at me and went crazy. I've never been so scared in all my life. No autopilot while flying in cloud, and I only had a screwdriver for self-defense. Air traffic control couldn't hear me beyond the squealing, so they weren't letting me into their airspace. So I just found some random strip and landed there. The villagers still think I owe them a pig. The pig's head was about a meter away from my microphone. I couldn't even hear myself speak. After a few more attempts trying to get clearance, they said I needed to adjust my radio. It was more convenient just to find a small airstrip at that point and let the villagers handle it. I also had an image of a big old piece of bacon running across the airport apron, charging passengers and boarding their plane. It wasn't ideal. To borrow my late uncle's story, he confided to me. He had a 182 on floats, and on several occasions was happy to play family airlines so that various relatives could make weddings and other events that were just too far for driving and overnighting. One trip was from home base Vancouver to Kamloops in the interior. He flew over VFR, and it was a pretty simple task to head out up the Fraser Valley until it pinched off at the town of Hope. At that point there is a notch in the wall of mountains through which the Coquihalla, both rivers, and Highway 5 goes. From there, following Highway 5 northeast brings you straight to Kamloops, their destination for the day, probably a 200-mile flight. The morning flight up was fine. The 3 passengers went to their event, and come afternoon's end they head back in what was supposed to be clear skies. Supposed. Flying the reverse route, clouds began to form quickly, on the forested sides of the valley, and soon rolled over the small plane. He was fairly confident of his heading, and stuck to it as the sky whited out. It was all he could do in a day without sat-nav equipment. If he was off by only a few degrees, they'd fly straight into a mountainside. His passengers seemed to take no notice, as they were recounting the day's events. Trying to climb above the cloud was just as dangerous. Small single-engine Cessnas are not pressurized, and even if it topped at, let's say, 6,000 feet, the last thing he wanted was to pop out on top of what might be a white surface as far as the eye could see. If he could drop down once past Hope, there was a good chance of flying under the soup back to Vancouver. It was, he said, the only time he was really scared in his airplane. The miles ticked away. They should be nearing Hope. He never saw it. Suddenly the clouds scattered, and before him spread the valley under a high ceiling. He threaded the needle, and had been right not to chance climbing it. They landed at the South Airport, and no one even commented about the can of paint they'd flown through. Didn't make me want to be a pilot. My father was a commercial pilot for over 35 years, and had been flying for over 45. He has all kinds of wild stories which range from searching for debris after the Challenger disaster to the mayhem he ensued as a pilot during the 9/11 attacks, and even towing banners at the Jersey Shore. But the craziest story I've asked him to retell a million times took place over the coast of New South Wales in Australia in the late 1970s. His plane and crew were in a traffic pattern, and they were delayed landing because there was quite literally an unidentified flying object on the radar that the tower was tracking. For a while they just circled around in a pattern waiting for other planes to land before they could enter the landing pattern, and lo and behold, the crew eventually got a direction of where this thing was, and when they looked out the window they could see a cigar-shaped craft moving very slowly in about their same altitude. Upon seeing this, all of the crew and passengers who could see it audibly gasped, and my dad says that that was the most disturbing part. Eventually, it went off scope, and they just all cleared to land and nothing more came of it. But it was always my favorite story to hear from my dad when I was a kid. I used to be a gliding instructor in those little truss-framed and fabric gliders. We're doing a training flight, and a bolt of lightning stuffs the ground about a mile from us. Unlike a lot of other aircrafts, we don't have a system in place to mitigate lightning strikes. Basically, it would have exploded, a good chunk if it had hit us. I have never descended and landed on the ground so quickly. That could have very easily been fatal. I was up at a rather nice kids camp one summer, installing some access controls, locks, card swipes and cameras and stuff. It was situated on a rather large lake. There was also a fire nearby. One day, I hear a bomber coming in for a refill. I should also take note that this lake has zip lines going across it, well-marked ones that pilots should be able to see from the air. The pilot saw it when it was almost too late, and I've never seen an aircraft like that climb so fast. People could have died easily. I was on an L-1011 flight, going back to Atlanta. We circled Atlanta forever it seemed, and then the co-pilot walks down my aisle, opens a hatch in the floor beside me, and starts cranking the hell out of a handle. He looked up at me and said, "The landing gear wouldn't go down." I said, "Good to know." I was relatively sure we were all about to perish. Safe to say, we managed to land safely. But it certainly made me never want to get on an aircraft again. I used to fly gliders. One of the instructors was very keen in not having the students ride the controls during tuition. If you had to breathe on the joystick, he would let you know in no uncertain terms that he was the PF. Once I'd soloed, he was a bit friendlier than before, and related a horror story of an ab initio student he'd flown with about 10 years earlier. The chappie in question was allegedly a former hang glider pilot and skydiver who was looking to expand his horizons. He was very confident and outgoing. His day job was a managing director, and was obviously very keen to get into the air. Fair enough. Having strapped him into the front seat, our instructor got in the back. The winch cable was attached, and off they went. The student locked on the controls. He had both feet hard on the rudder pedals and was holding the stick centrally, with an absolute grip of iron. He was in total panic, and by this stage the glider was passing through 200 feet and starting to drift to one side. The instructor had to shout at the student several times to let go of everything. By the time he complied, the cable release pulled, and they were a long way off to the side and a lot lower than a normal launch. This was a ride site, and they could have still moved forward to the lift, but he was so shaken up, he elected to fly a shortened circuit and land. Throughout the approach, he was terrified this clown was going to go for controls again, but fortunately they landed without further incident. I suspect the post-flight debriefing was short and interesting, and probably ended with him departing rather more quietly than he arrived. A few years later, our instructor heard he had bought a Cessna based at a field 20 miles away. Perhaps he learned his lesson, or perhaps he was destined to become a statistic. I am an AF Combat Systems officer. We were on a military training route. Pretty much what it sounds like. Airspace that's supposed to be cleared out so military jets can practice maneuvers without worrying too much about civilian aircrafts. We're about 300 feet AGL cruising along at 420 knots when our TCAS collision alert system, using onboard radar, starts blaring at us. We all look around and don't see anything around us, when suddenly some jackass in a little propeller plane, who wasn't squawking, pulled in a climb about 50 feet off our nose. Pilot brakes hard to the right, and we narrowly avoided a mid-air collision. This could have been disastrous. My great-uncle Ira flew in a B-24 in World War II as a bombardier. He never talked about the war, especially to a kid who was only 11 or 12 in the mid-80s. But one year he came to our town for the 4th of July. We were watching the fireworks in our front yard, and he went missing. I went looking for him and found him at the back of our living room sitting on the floor. I was just a kid and didn't understand what PTSD was, although later in life I realized that I knew and worked with a lot of people who had it. I asked what was wrong, and he just looked at me with these haunted eyes and said, I used to look down through my reticle at towns and cities we flew over, and I'd see these little pops of smoke, and I'd know they were coming. He went on to describe the flak. How you could only barely see the flak cannons firing if you were pretty low, and then you couldn't see the shells until they started blowing up all around you. He told me that he felt every little white pop of smoke he saw as if it were the one that was going to bring him down, like it went right through him. I didn't see it, but every time I see flak in movies now, I think of my great-uncle Ira and that look in his eyes. I used to be fine with turbulence, until I was on a flight from Indonesia that hit the worst patch I've ever encountered. I knew it was going to be rough when one of the cabin crew abandoned her trolley and strapped in next to me. The next hour of my life was by far the most frightening. The plane was about 2/3 full, and there wasn't a single sound from the passengers as the plane thrashed around. I shared a bottle of vodka with the guy sitting on the other side of me. We just passed it back and forth without saying a word. The flight ended up diverting as one of the engines, no joke, crapped out while the plane was jolting around. Can you imagine the fear we were feeling knowing that we were flying one engine short? That was nearly 30 years ago, and every time I think back on it I get chills. I still grip my seat armrest at even the slightest bump in the air these days. I was flying out of Atlanta because my trip began at 4 a.m. Atlanta wasn't my first flight of the day, and I'd pulled an all-nighter and had been up for well over 24 hours by this point. I was looking forward to getting a few hours sleep on the plane, but the gods decided to spit on my plans. Approaching the jetway, my boarding pass scans, beeps once instead of twice, and a slip of paper comes out of the scanner. I have a new seat assignment. Cool. I get in my seat. There's barely any space left in the overhead, and I can't fit my carry-on up there. The attendant says that the bag will have to be left behind in Atlanta and shipped to me later on. Then a gentleman in the seat back speaks up and points out the space in another overhead. So everything's fine. I sit down, and in a few minutes or so, the plane begins to back away from the jetway. And at this precise moment, the guy across the aisle from me vomits explosively. 3 times. It hits him, the 2 people on either side of him, and the row in front of him for good measure. Everyone around freaks and starts spamming the call attendant buttons. They shout back that since the airplane has begun to taxi, nothing can be done until we've reached cruising altitude. The spamming continues, and finally one of the attendants decides to see what everyone is flipping out about. She walks back, gets one look and utters, "Oh my god." Across the aisle from this, myself at a window seat and the guy next to me just had our noses buried in the collars of our coats, trying not to throw up as well, as at this point the smell has wafted through the cabin and we can hear a chorus of other people beginning to retch and heave in response. There's nothing for it. The unfortunate puke brigade can't get out of their seats until we reach cruising, so the flight attendants, backed up by a second, try to do what they can until that point. Finally, once we reach cruising, all of them flee to the bathrooms and cleanup begins. Except at first, they can't find an air spray, so the first flight attendant begins spraying vanilla-scented perfume everywhere in an attempt to mask the smell of vomit, which did not improve matters. The next one found a can of Febreze, and she sprayed half the can in the affected area. People rapidly started complaining of headaches, and seatmate and myself are now completely unable to breathe. The first attendant has started biohazard cleanup at this point, sprinkling puke dust everywhere to contain the mess, since it can't be cleaned up fully mid-air. During this, the flight attendant catches on that the Febreze is killing everyone, so they go and get a bag of ground coffee beans, which finally remedies the situation. Until someone starts complaining about the smell of coffee. They bring the Febreze back, and me and my seatmate slowly start to die. We never saw the people who got puked on again, but we saw the puker once more when he came back to get something from his bag. Apparently he didn't have a change of clothes, so the attendants tied paper napkins all over his chest, to the amusement of no one. Beverage services saw the purchase of a metric ton of alcohol, and the first attendant was later joking about burning her uniform. The great pukening was all anyone could talk about for the whole flight and deplaning. As soon as we landed, phones came out so that everyone could complain to their friends and relatives. No sleep was had on those 2 hours. When my stepdad was getting his pilot's license years ago, he was doing all kinds of tricks in a small aircraft, flying it up and down like a zigzag. Before one of the drops, my sister had taken her seatbelt off, unbeknownst to everyone else on the plane, because she dropped her Furby on the floor. The plane went down, she went up. Her head split and splurted blood everywhere and completely drenched me. We sat like that, drenched in her blood for hours, until we could have an emergency landing on a hospital roof in the middle of nowhere. We have photos from that day, standing on the wing with our Furbies in our hands, which is happy and creepy to look back on. I was working on an airline, and one day there was smoke in the cockpit when we landed. Thankfully, it was when I landed, and we had to push the airplane off the runway. We also almost had 2 mid-air collisions, one due to a new pilot not being where he should be, and another due to control telling me an aircraft was at my 11 o'clock, when in reality it was at my 2 o'clock. The coolest was a meteor that burned up directly in front of me, same altitude, straight ahead. I have no idea how far away it was, but it was bright and pretty, and went through a spectrum of colors as it burned. I work at a business that designs and manufactures coffins, so not directly around death, but pretty damn close. Oftentimes we receive special requests from the deceased family to engrave messages or even images on the coffin. The most common by far is the birth date and death date, the dead person's name, and we even get requests to engrave their face on the coffin. It was about 5 years ago I got a call from someone who had recently ordered a generic wooden coffin. It doesn't matter how many of these calls I've had to take over the years, it's depressing every single time I have to listen to someone talk about their dead loved one. This woman was almost in tears from the second I picked up the phone, and I was certainly in tears by the end of it. She told me the story of her father who had flown Boeing planes throughout the Vietnam War and had gone to become a commercial pilot for Pan Am. Flying airplanes was his entire life. Finally, she told me about how her father had been hit by a sudden heart attack at the age of 74 after being as healthy as a horse his entire life. While lying on a hospital bed, almost waiting to die, he looked out the window and to his right whispered what turned out to be his last words. "Looks like a beautiful night to fly." The woman asked me to engrave those words on his coffin, and I cried for a while after that. Thank you everyone for flying with Mort Airlines. We will be arriving shortly. In the meantime, I would like to give a huge thank you to everyone listening, as well as my members and supporters over at Patreon and Ko-fi for your continued support. If you'd like to see another video, a link on screen can be found now for even more entertainment. And don't forget to download our app for heaps of content ad-free that I'm sure you will all love and enjoy. But for now, watch something else done by me on screen. Stay awesome. Hopefully, see you in the next one.